Okay, hi everyone. The Deep Learning Indaba would like to welcome everyone to the first Indaba Spotlight Talk series. These talks are aimed at providing useful information and dialogue on topics relevant to the Deep Learning Indaba community. These topics range from publishing a research paper to planning a research career and other fundamental skills useful to the African machine learning community. For our first session, we are thrilled to have Tessa Darbyshire and Amandalynne Pauladda talk to us about advice for publishing from a scientific editor. We're sure you'll be inspired after the session to start writing your own papers, so be sure to apply for the mentorship session. All relevant links are available on the website.
We'd like to introduce our speakers before handing over to them for the talk. So we have Tessa. Tessa is a scientific editor at Patterns with specialization in the fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics of AI. Her research interests are around human-computer interactions, trust, and explainability. We also have Amandalynne, who is a PhD student in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her research involves applied natural language processing for information extraction from scientific text, primarily in the biomedical domain. She is also interested in accounting for the broader impacts of data use in machine learning. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Oops, I turned my camera off. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I will go and see if I can make the presentation work, which was the bit that I was less than sure about. Share screen. Can you see what I'm looking at?
Yeah, Patterns, ask us anything.
That's the one, fantastic. Okay, so then I will go through this presentation. The purpose of the presentation is just to address some top-level questions we get asked. If you're out there and you're very experienced in publishing, there'll be something in it for you, but we're really aiming for that broad audience and answering all the questions that commonly come up when we're talking about this kind of topic. There's an introductory slide, but we just had a wonderful introduction. So we wanted to start with looking at what questions we get when we talk about the editorial process. And the questions that tend to come up are things like, what happens during the editorial process? What are editors and reviewers looking for? What resources are available to guide authors? How do you sell your work into journals as an author? And how can you get help if you need it? And these are the questions that generally come up. But we wanted to start with the big question, which is why publish at all? And it can be a weird and murky mess. So when you're talking about why publish at all, there's lots of different strands to that. So the one that people will tell you about is that the great thing about publishing is that you share your research with others and you get feedback from the community through the review and publication process. You also get things like proper archiving, really depending on the venue. So it's always worth checking with the venue you're considering what their archiving process is. Then there's the aspect which is about influence. So through publishing your research, you can influence the policy, practice, and culture of research as a whole. And there's also an underbelly that people don't talk about as much, which is that it's a currency for academic advancement. So those are the top level answers to the question, why do we do this at all? So the next question is about what happens in the editorial process, and it really does depend on the type of venue that you go to. So the first option is preprint servers, things like arXiv, bioRxiv. There's lots of these knocking around, and they are author-controlled publication. The advantage of that is that it's easy to get your work live and available. The disadvantage is that it can have a huge volume of information, and the lack of a review process can lead to low-quality publications. So that's preprint servers. The second option is conferences, which if you're out there and you're working in the AI, ML, computer science space, conferences are probably one of your biggest venues. And they tend to have teams of volunteer editors, and they have a clear timeline and specific themes. I really recommend publishing with conferences because it's a live environment and there's people working on your topic. So if you participate in workshops and tutorials, you have a real opportunity to enrich your own work and the work of other people along a specific theme. So it'd be a fantastic opportunity. The disadvantage is that because of the volume of submissions and that there are teams of volunteer editors, you can get lower quality reviews or longer review timelines. And there's not many options to re-engage. So if your paper gets rejected, it's quite difficult to understand why. The next option is society journals. And these are volunteer editors with active academic careers. The great thing about society journals is that you do get that support from active researchers in your field in the editorial process. The disadvantage is long review timelines, and you will hear horror stories of 4-year timelines. That doesn't happen very often, so don't be put off by that, but you should expect longer turnarounds than the other venue types. And then the final option is primary journals, and they're primary because they have teams of professional editors that specialize in given topics. So I'm a professional editor and I specialize in the ethics of AI, and I cover all topics across all domains in that space. The advantage is that you get full-time, normally one-to-one editorial support through the submission process, so you have real access to the person handling your paper. And the disadvantages are the fees and paywalls. And there are different ways of funding journals, and I'm happy to talk about those different approaches if that's of interest in the Q&A. This is a grid I nicked from someone else, but it does give you an idea of how that process works. So at the top, you've got articles coming in. When they come to me, they get assessed initially at desk, which is just means so just by me and my team. We can reject at that point, or they can be sent out to reviewers. If they go out to review, they go through a review process, which is round 1 review, opportunity to amend, round 2 review, opportunity to amend. So you get 2 chances in most venues to make changes to your paper in line with the comments from the reviewers. That's actually not the case in conferences. Because of the short timelines, sometimes you don't get the multiple review rounds, and that's worth being aware of and checking in advance. As the editor of the paper, we assess the reviews as they come back in, and depending on what the feedback is, we help support authors in amending the paper, or we recommend another venue, or we reject the paper at that point. If you get a rejection or a recommendation for another journal, that doesn't mean that your paper isn't good or isn't good enough. Take that feedback on board from the reviewers and the editor, and then go and have a look at other places where it might be a better fit. Sometimes it's a scope challenge, sometimes it's a volume of submissions challenge, and you might not know exactly why your paper's been rejected. When we're talking about that, the next question is about what are editors and reviewers looking for? And I cannot hammer this home enough. The easiest way to find this out is to go out and ask them. There's lots of options. Different venues have different approaches. So with patterns, we take pre-submissions of papers, so you can just send us an email and say, do you think this would be in scope? And we can talk to you about it at that point. You can approach the editors and ask for time. So at all of the Cell Press journals, there's an option to book time with editors through our contact system. And you can just book 20 minutes of our time and have a discussion about your paper or your ideas. I've got one after this call, actually. Then there's another option. So you can contact recent authors. So people like Amandalynne, who's a delight for coming on this call with me, speak to people who are publishing at that venue and get a feel for what their experience was like. And you can speak to researchers that you really admire. When I speak to younger researchers in particular, they often say that they feel kind of overawed by these bigger names. But if you send them an email, generally people are up for spending 20 minutes with you. Most people have that time. But having said that, ask, there are things that journals generally look out for that I would really recommend ensuring that you have included before you submit formally. And that's things like strong related work sections. I cannot express the importance of making sure that your work is grounded in context. The most common piece of feedback I give to authors is that whilst their work is novel, interesting, fascinating, what they haven't done is ground it in the context of what else is happening in the space. At Patterns specifically, we have FAIR data requirements, and those are relatively common now across all the data journals. If you don't know about FAIR, go and check out their guidelines. We also have things like responsible data science guidelines that are actually up and coming. So if anyone would like to talk to me about what it would mean to have responsible data science guidelines at a journal, send me an email. And then this one I've actually included as a bit of a personal bugbear. I do like justified generalizability. And we find that a lot at AI and ML journals is that you get big, quite hyperbolic claims in this relatively nascent field. And it's really important to make sure that you get a critical eye to look over your paper just to make sure that you aren't making any of those big unjustified claims. So this is something that I thought you all might like to see. So when I send a paper out for review, I'm sorry for the blur in the resolution there. I hope it's better on your end. What we do when we send a paper out to reviewers is we ask them these very standard questions. So the top one there is about conceptually novel ideas of broad interest. Are the conclusions supported by the results? Do you believe that it's reproducible? There is a numbers rating system, and most journals and conferences have this. The concrete number itself doesn't matter, and an author will never see it. It just gives the editor a gauge on how the reviewer feels about the paper. So don't worry too much about the numbers. We do ask reviewers then to consider their own approach. Did you say what work could be done in order to achieve the rating that you've suggested? Did anyone assist you? And does it present a topic of broad interest to the data science community, which is just a question for patterns. So most journals and conferences will have something like this. If you ask editors, they may share this with you, which will give you a good idea of how to approach that venue. I can't guarantee that, but it's certainly something that I've done with my authors to give them an idea of how to approach it. Forgive my little doodles. I do tend to include them in my presentations. So we get a lot of people coming to us and saying things like, how can I get my research published in your venue? And unfortunately for those people, the answer is often something a bit like this. If you read our guidance, including 3 through 217, and you bend over and you hit this target with that yo-yo, maybe we'll think about it. And that can be quite disheartening. And sometimes that happens because the person you've asked doesn't have time to hold your hand through the process. So the way to deal with that, the best way to deal with that is really invest in getting to know the venues that you're considering. Most venues will have their guidelines up on the website, and it might seem like there's a lot of content, but if you've got 2 or 3 co-authors, go through it together, take the time over it, because that will mean that when you approach the editors, you'll have specific questions you can ask, and that will mean that you get more valuable information. So I would recommend that before you approach someone, you do take the time to make sure that your questions are clear and that you've taken the time to get to know the venue. So we get lots of papers, for example, with cover letters like, "Dear Sir or Madam, we are considering publishing in your venue." And we can tell when you've copied and pasted it and sent it to multiple places. And it does give a feeling of a lack of investment. So I would really encourage that you take the time to get to know wherever you're considering publishing. And there are things that are unique to certain places. So NeurIPS, the conference, requires impact statements from authors now. You have to say how your research is likely to impact the audience, the population. SIGKID has a negative results requirement. So they ask authors to talk about places where their results weren't as positive. And again, that's a specific challenge to the ML and AI community, where we tend to focus on positive results and leave out negative sections. And in other domains like health sciences, they have really clear rules and regulations around that. In AI and ML, we're just starting to bring in that governance. So we're evolving. And Patents has responsible data science guidelines. So it's really worth making sure venues aren't all the same. They all have their own approach and their own system. And it's worth making sure that you know what you're running into. One other thing to mention that I mentioned because someone asked me about it. If you have a lab bias, you don't have to publish in a particular venue just because your boss does. So sometimes, we've always published in Cell, for example. But that doesn't mean that Cell's the best venue for you and your paper. There are 8,000 journals with hundreds more starting up every year. Really take the time to get to know where you want to publish. And so I just wanted to include this. This is the SIGKID guidelines about negative results. And they really do welcome submissions from people who are showcasing places where it didn't go as well. And that's fantastic to see. And I do hope that we see more of this in other venues, because it's part of that responsible AI and ML discussion. This is the question that I probably get asked the most. How do I sell my work in? And the answer is to game it. If you haven't considered what's going on in the context of your submission, you undermine your own work. So like I said earlier, pick the right venue, make sure that you're in the right place. Watch out for collections and calls. So Patents, for example, has 3 calls live at the moment. We have one on machine listening, so we're encouraging natural language processing submissions. We have one on precision medicine, and we have one on responsible AI. So because we're actively seeking papers in those areas, it's a really good time to approach us on those topics. And we'll have coming up calls on things like mechanism design for social good. And that's to support EMO, which is a new ACM conference. So we all exist in an ecosystem, and there's good times to submit. So once you've made sure that you're in the right place, you've got the right paper, and it's the right time, find the people who can help you. And again, I cannot hammer this home enough. Bother them until they do. Chase them up. Send extra emails. If they replied to one and said that they wanted to help you, but they didn't have time then. Yeah. So I personally have a spreadsheet where I have every person I've ever emailed in this job in this spreadsheet, and I have timelines for coming back to them so that I can manage who's expecting contacts from me and when. And Amandalynne will be able to tell you that it's annoying as hell, but I will generally be around to do that, chasing people up. And then the other thing you really should do as an author is master the art of rejection. Consider transferring within families, which most journals will offer you, and make sure that you've got a backup plan. So when you send your paper in to one conference, to your star conference, make sure that in your mind you've got a backup that where you'll send it if it doesn't get in there. Again, your paper hasn't necessarily been rejected because it's bad, but you should take on board that feedback and consider other venues. So the next slide is about how you can get help if you need it. Another really common question we get is about funding. So Patterns, for example, is open access, and that means that we charge authors fees in order to publish with us. And so Nature Machine Intelligence's fees are now 10 grand, which is wild. And if you look at that as an author, it can be a little bit undermining. You can feel like you shouldn't approach, or you shouldn't get involved with that. But actually, what you should do is approach the editor and ask them about what funding they have available. Patterns, for example, is able to offer 50% and 100% waivers to support research that we really believe in. And there's lots of different offers that come with the different collections. So it's worth bearing in mind that there will be funding opportunities. Conferences are now getting great at sponsoring people to attend and to present. So don't be put off immediately by funding. So submission help, like I've said, go out and ask people, come and ask the editors, go and ask people in your lab, in your network, people that have published before. And that's really worth doing just in terms of understanding. But most venues will also have submission assistance teams. So ours are called Editorial Operations, and they support authors through the submission mask, which can seem a bit overwhelming because when you first submit a paper, there are lots of requirements. So it'll ask you for a declaration of interest, a conflict of interest. It will ask you for diversity statements, and there's lots of different bits of paperwork that go with the different venues, and there's generally someone around whose job it is to support you through that. The last thing that you should really look out for, and the great thing about Deep Learning Indaba and this mentorship series is that we need to build mentoring relationships. Don't be afraid to approach people, and don't be afraid to approach organizers of these kind of things. So send Siobhan an email. She's great. So then what I wanted to do was, so when we first talked about this presentation, we put it out there to the community and said, please come and ask us your questions. And a few of those came back. So we were asked, how are submissions evaluated? And I've shown you that list of questions for reviewers. The answer for how they're evaluated actually for us depends on the type of paper. So we have, and most venues have, back matter and front matter. Front matter is things like opinion articles, which are shorter and a touch more vitriolic, and back matter is the more traditional kind of research, review, perspective. And our front matter are editorial evaluated, which means that they come to me and I decide whether they go in the journal. And then back matter is peer reviewed. So that can take up to 3 months through 2 rounds of review. And when I invite reviewers, because Patterns is cross-domain, we specifically make sure that the review panel is cross-domain. But at other venues, that will depend on who the editors are and who their review pool is. If you'd like to be a reviewer, please do send me an email. We'd love to have you. The next question was about, is publishing only meant for academics? The answer to that question is no. We are quite broad in terms of, so Patterns, again, in particular, is meant to cover governance and academia and industry. So in theory, the answer to that is no. So the next question really shines some light on that. Are there incentives and value for producing publishable work? And that really depends on the company or the organization that you're working in. So we get tons of submissions from Microsoft, from IBM, from Twitter, from Facebook, because these are big companies that invest in their research departments. IBM in particular has a massive publishable output, and you'll see them at conferences with their many, many presentations because they make it a priority for the people working in their organization. If it isn't a priority in your organization, you will find it challenging, but that doesn't mean that you would be rejected because you're coming from outside academia. So if you're willing to put that work in, send it to the journals, send it to the conferences, it will be considered. The last question was about how to do ethical ML research and make it reflexive in a paper. And the answer to that is a little cloudy, because at the moment there are so many guidelines available on how to do ethical ML. One of the best ways to build it into your paper is to find a checklist and ensure that as you go through the checklist that you have hit the points at each stage. One of the big problems for ethics is that it's often tacked on the end. The Neurops impact statement has actually encountered this problem. People often just stick it in a little paragraph and say, yeah, you know it's ethical, don't worry. But in terms of building it in and making it reflexive, it's really useful to find forms that will support you in working out where to put things. And I did want to include, I apologize for the last minute nature of this slide, but these are two checklists that are available for authors. The first one's from Tripod, which is about prediction model development, and the second one is from the UK Statistics Authority. And both are designed to support people in creating publishable outputs that are ethical in a deep way rather than in the shallow and tacked on way. So the next bit's the Q&A, and what I wanted to do here was give you some inspiration of kind of questions that we're happy to answer. You know, what's it like for an author? As I said, Amandalynne's here, so if you've got questions for an author, she's here and ready to answer those questions. I can answer questions about funding models, about biases in the publishing industry, about avoiding the hype train in machine learning, about how to avoid feeling dejected, why we reject papers and why, when to withdraw, and how to find the right venue. And I'm happy to answer questions on any of these topics. And then, yeah, so this is us. And please do get in touch, send us emails, happy to support in any way that we can. There we go. Have I successfully stopped sharing the screen?
Yes. Okay. So let me start off with just some questions. I'll start off with one, I guess, question that I had while listening to your presentation. I think what you said about lab bias is pretty critical in the field. Let's say everyone in your lab only regards certain journals in high regard. Like, do you have maybe strategies for handling lab bias? Because people might be sort of biased in what they think is a valid lab, and you try to submit to other labs. I don't know, you might get friction in your lab. Do you have any tips on how to handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tips for that are very interpersonal. It's about pitching it in the right way. If you found a venue that you really believe is the best home for your paper, and you rely on the approval from someone else, so often, so a PhD student will need advisor approval for a certain venue. Just make sure that when you pitch it in, you're careful about why they're really invested in their previous venue, why you really believe this is the right home, and what potential issues will come up. So that's really all about how you manage the conversation as you pitch the new idea.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I saw my question pops up. Oh, we got one from Nilesh. Let's rather go there.
Using the right keywords. Oh yeah, absolutely. Keywords are wonderful, and they do. For me, most of what they do is help me find the right reviewers for your paper, and that can really support in terms of understanding what your paper's about and how to do it. They probably won't. They'll help you sell the idea, but there aren't buzzwords that will guarantee publication. So I'd be a little bit careful about it. I'm not quite sure what your question means in terms of if you use the right words, will I publish your research? That's a little bit more contentious. Oh, how important is impact factor, site score, and other metrics? Now, that really depends on who you ask. Amandalynne, do you mind if I ask you why you chose patterns and whether you considered any of these metrics when you approached us? Oh, I think she might be frozen.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, my Wi-Fi has been a bit spotty this morning. Also, I'm in a morning time zone. It's 8 a.m. for me. So sorry if I'm a little spacey. But yeah, I think what drew me to patterns was that there is a very clear sort of emphasis on trying to...
Oh dear. Maybe while we wait for her to connect, I'll just do a little bit of an overview of those metrics. So impact factor really depends on where you're from. So if you're an author writing in India, you'll find that your lab might mandate that a journal must have a certain impact factor in order for you to publish, and that makes it quite important. But in terms of how we view it, impact factor, site score, and various other metrics are quite narrow understandings of what a journal does and how it's performing. So it really depends on how you feel about the validity of those metrics. Amandalynne, you're moving again.
Oh no, how far did I get before I got cut off?
You said what drew me to patterns was...
Oh no, okay. Well, yeah, I was talking about the journal's emphasis on kind of ethical research and trying to do more of that reflexive accounting for, you know, why machine learning research is done the way it is currently, and trying to kind of broaden participation in machine learning research. And yeah, I also personally, so this, I guess it was, I got lucky, was that because the article was commissioned, that waived some of the process.
Oh dear, she's gone again. So the answer to the question is that it depends on how important...
Oh, am I back? Okay.
Yes, you're back now. Hi.
Sorry. I was just going to finish up by saying that, yeah, just it was important to me also that the paper be available.
Sorry, expect where she's going with this is that patterns is open access, which does make life a lot easier. So the metrics might be important to you, but there might be other things like whether a journal's open access, whether a journal has specific ethical guidelines. Like all of these things are important, and it's just about how important they are to you. Oh, she's moving again. No. Okay, shall we go to the next question? Or is that the one that's up on the screen? What is your advice about bouncing back after a viewer's bad comment or rejection? So the answer to that question is that it depends what they said. So we do sometimes get reviewers who come out of the door swinging, and they are perhaps opposed for some reason. Perhaps they're working on an opposed research project and their feedback, for whatever reason, is infeasible. And that is an option. So when you get your response from the editor about the reviews, the editor will say that if you think that a review is not possible within the time frame, opposed, or asking more than is within the scope of your current research project, then you can flag that. So there is some negotiation over bad reviews, and it's very difficult not to take it personally when it lands in your inbox. And it's important to take that moment to take it personally. Be mad, call your co-authors, get through that immediate feeling, and then have another look through what they said, through the email, look at the points of negotiation. Editors will take you on if you come back and say, no, we can't do it because I've only got a week. And they will take all of that into consideration. So my advice is to go through the emotion, experience the intensity of it, be annoyed, and then come back with a plan. If you actually get a rejection on the basis, the answer to that, again, is to feel the emotion and then decide what you're going to do next. Like, don't write the paper off because you've put time and work in. Just look for somewhere else to publish. Ask the editors. They're the people who rejected your paper, might be able to support you in where a better location might be.
Thanks. Amandalynne, do you have any perspective from the author side?
First, I'll just say I'm so sorry for the Wi-Fi issues. Hopefully, I'm a little bit better now that I've moved to a separate spot in the house. But yeah, I would just echo what Tessa said about just when you get a rejection or a bad comment, don't, act on it. Just kind of take a step back and, work through the, dejected angry email or an angry tweet or anything. And I would say in my experience, like having a more experienced person to talk through it with is really handy, because sometimes it's the case that maybe the reviewer just really didn't understand your paper, or if they've made a really valid comment, they're something new, not death of your paper. You can bounce back either by rebutting if that's an option, or submitting somewhere else that might be a more appropriate home for your paper. But I would say, yeah, talk to your co-authors or someone who knows your work and can the comment was about, and if it's valid or if they just didn't understand. And also just, I think more broadly, bouncing back from rejection, I would say like, do something that has nothing to do with the paper and remind yourself that, yeah, life's pretty cool. I can, make myself proud in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for a walk. Don't send that tweet. We can't help you once you've made it public. Oh, is that your next question? Excellent.
Yes.
More about what biases are in the publishing industry and how these are being addressed. So that's a really interesting question, because the answer is that the publishing industry is intensely biased and historically so. So it's biased towards Europe and America in terms of authors. And there's an increasing, and that is changing as journals tackle it and as conferences tackle it. So you'll notice now that things like NeurIPS has introduced ways of sponsoring people from the global south to make sure that there's more diversity, that there's more inclusion. But the best way it's being addressed is actually through groups like this, through Deep Learning Indaba, through Masakane, groups that are building it for themselves and going out to the journals and saying, look, this is just as valid and just as good. So I'm quite lucky as an editor because I'm at quite a new journal. I have a lot of time to spend on things like this. I can invest in new groups. I can invest in new authors. I can take chances. Whereas editors at much bigger journals will be facing massive handling duties. And whilst the journal might say, we're working on our inclusivity, we're working on our diversity, the time pressures on the people handling the papers is immense. And it's very reliant on individual editor activities. So what there absolutely are individual editors out there doing what they can. There are organizations doing what they can. And responding to that is a really strong strategy. So if you see a venue that you've always dreamed of being published in, but you feel like they might be biased against you, just send them an email. Actually, if you want to talk about this, I really recommend Jade Abbott at Masakane. She actually does activist publishing, where she deliberately targets venues she considers biased against her in order to prove that she can get in. So I'd really recommend going and getting involved in the activist publishing groups, because they're really good fun.
Oh, sorry, we're moving on to the next question.
Please feel free to.
You had some great stuff about that last time. If you want to talk, if you want to do a little bit about bias in publishing.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add that something that I find sort of unfortunate is that the vast majority of academic publishing is in English, and so you're already sort of at a disadvantage if that's not a language that you're comfortable in. And there are certain, people will be prescriptive about academic writing, and there are certain sort of unspoken standards about using the royal we, even if you're a single author, or having, what's considered like proper conventions of spelling and grammar. And so if you aren't a native speaker of English, or if you're not comfortable writing in sort of academic English, it's really handy to have someone like proofread your paper and like kind of help you go through the mechanics. Because I guess, while the publishing industry is mostly in English, I guess the best that you can do is just get help. It would be great if there were more, publications that could be in people's native languages. And
yeah, I mean, Deep Learning Indaba, the journal. This would be fantastic. Yes, so the other thing to add to that is that there is actually bias internally in the publishing industry. So you'll find that most editors are women. And this is because academia is biased against women. So they tend to go up through the research chain, find that they're really struggling with the bias, and then leave academia in favor of publishing. So there's biases within the system, and there's lots of different initiatives trying to tackle it. Oh, how do I ensure reviewers are calibrated? Calibrated as in, I don't know, Avishka, actually, if you could just provide a bit more information about what you mean by calibrated before I go off on a bit of waffle based on my interpretation of your questions. If you just comment again and give me a bit more information about what you mean by that, that would be great. What's the next one? Issues you've seen with incentive structures in countries, universities, and companies. Publishing models. So incentive structures in companies first, that really depends on the company you work for. And there's often a bit of a hard line between company does offer incentives for publishing and company doesn't offer incentive for publishing. So rather there being any issues with it, it's more hard line in terms of whether the company you work for offers you space to do research. I do, as I said, work with researchers who are working independently, almost in spite of their company's lack of incentives. And we do support and encourage them, but it is a harder road. So when you're taking on roles, it's worth considering whether you'll be given time to do the research that you'd like to do. Universities is a really interesting question. So I was actually talking to people in universities in South Africa recently, and they were saying that there is limited incentive for publishing because they simply don't have the funding available, and that's a real challenge. Again, as we were saying earlier, one of the best ways to deal with that is to approach the venues and ask if they can offer you funding support, because that is generally available, as much as they might not be talking about it enough. Countries specifically, so if you're working in China, for example, China has a real focus on impact factor for a journal, and that can really limit the range of venues that you're able to publish at. I'm not sure if that's quite the answer you're looking for, but I feel like I've hit some beats there. Please do ask follow-up questions if there's more I can tell you. Amandalynne, have you come across any of this from your perspective? Oh, she's frozen. All right, next, we'll pick her up in a bit.
I think we can go back to Vishka's question.
Excellent.
About the calibration, I think he elaborated.
Since a subset of all reviewers review each paper, and you've mentioned they have some numeric scores, how do you? So my reviewer pool is massive. So there's very rarely overlap when people are reviewing multiple papers. Since I'll review each paper, and you mentioned they have the numeric scores are simply there to give the editors a steer on how the reviewer feels about a paper. It's generally high or low. If you get a middling number, then it just means that they kind of felt a bit meh about it. If you get a higher number, then that's generally quite positive. And if they put a lower number, they're generally trying to tell you that they would consider it a reject. And they do have an opportunity to put in words as well. So you can, so when a reviewer comes back to me, they can say accept, minor revisions, major revisions, inappropriate for publication at all, and more appropriate at another venue. And those are the word versions of the scores. So there isn't anything about the numeric scores in and of themselves that ensures that the review is fair. The review is taken as a whole. And if I consider an individual review unfair for any reason, then I'll often put in the notes to the author when I pass the feedback on that I would perhaps consider this beyond the scope of the project or opposed. So it's more interpersonal than your question makes it seem. So it's less formal and more about the negotiation between the people. So yes, this is where I, as an editor, generally step in and act as the interface between the authors and the reviewers, because that's my job.
I'll add just a couple of things. Oh, sorry. If that's okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, so something that was nice about publishing with Patterns was that the reviews came from apparently quite different expertise sort of areas. Like just judging on what references were suggested, it seemed like there was kind of a diversity of expertise amongst the reviewers. And obviously they're anonymous, so I don't know who they are, but I guess that's one way of ensuring that the work is fairly evaluated, and that it's getting, depending on the venue that you're going for, you might get people who are just experts in just natural language processing, or you might get people who are sort of from different backgrounds in the humanities or in engineering. And then I guess to add also about sort of like the meta review aspect. So I know that for some NLP conferences that there, in addition to having anonymous reviewers, there's also area chairs who I think can kind of, you know, check the scores on each review and make sure that there is, like if there's disagreement or if there's kind of like not consistent scoring of a paper, they'll take the time to look at the reviews and the paper and see, you know, whether they can make sense of like, is this paper actually being fairly evaluated or not? And I'll say that too, a lot of this work is done by volunteers, and so it's hard and sometimes thankless and invisible. So, you know, remember that there are people on the other side of this working very hard to ensure that your work is, you know, being fairly evaluated.
That's definitely the one. Just remembering that all people are people. Just because they're called reviewer 1 doesn't mean that they're less human. And there's also, for each paper, there's 3 reviewers, and the reviewers can see each other's comments. So when you come back in the second round, the reviewers sometimes trash each other for being too hard or for being too easy. So there's the editor and the 3 reviewers all work in collaboration, all with complete visibility on your paper and on the feedback. So it's certainly taken by, it's a group decision rather than any one person.
I'd like to chip in with a question. I'm thinking of early career researchers who maybe don't have supervisors that are that involved, and they're kind of just tacked on as the co-authors. Any advice for someone that's going this like almost on their own and their first time?
I'm well handing that one to Amandalynne. That's really her field. If she's moving.
Yeah, maybe Amandalynne, turning off your camera, then we could hear you.
Sorry, I think I must have missed a question. I just heard turn off my camera.
Oh, I'm happy to ask it again. It's my own question, so it's not listed on the screen. I just thought your stream would be smoother with your camera off. So the question is geared at somebody that's an early career researcher that's pretty much, you know, going at it alone with their supervisors that aren't really involved. They're just kind of tacked on as co-authors. If you have any advice for someone that's just, yeah, starting out and not much experience.
Yeah, I would say that, so I guess a couple things. One is that you can, something that I've found to be really beneficial to me over the course of my PhD is to kind of, you know, look broadly for mentorship. So not just from your own supervisor, but from senior PhD students or from other people that you meet at conferences or from, you know, potential collaborators, you know, elsewhere in the university or whatever sort of organization you're with. Because I think I don't think you'll be, you know, happy or successful if you're just relying on one person to be your sole source of mentorship and research guidance. And so I guess as a first-time author, I would say, yeah, like don't just rely on your supervisor for advice. And I think there's just kind of a large universe of things that come up. One is, I think Tessa spoke earlier to the importance of having a quality literature review, but I think as an early career researcher, it's very hard to know when to stop because every paper you read, you're like going down this rabbit hole of like, oh, I should read this reference to contextualize this paper, but in order to do that, I need the paper. And so I would say I'm still kind of learning the art of that. And I would say be aware of, you know, ask someone for advice on like, how do I know when to stop just like doing the lit review? And I think if not your supervisor, then someone else in the field can help you, you know, try to balance that. Hopefully that answers the question. I think there's a lot of different ways I could have answered it.
Yeah, but I think you've also motivated well for the Deep Learning Indaba's mentorship program. That's why we're here. So you have access to people that can help you for exactly that reason. Thank you so much.
I would like to echo that sentiment. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to write a paper. Find your village. That is the best advice that I can give you.
Okay, I'd like to chip in for the next question. I think this is mainly aimed at Tessa. So I guess in the modern submission world, what would you say is the role of, let's say, source code or new data sets in the submissions that you receive? Do people review the source code, have a look at the data sets? Do you think they contribute to the quality of the submissions?
So Patterns has a data and code availability statement. And if you are citing new code, new data, you have to make it available to the reviewers in order for it to be considered reproducible. We simply can't publish things. There is a balance of, so it's as open as possible and as closed as necessary is how we talk about it internally. Your data needs to be as open as it can possibly be, and we do understand that there are limitations for privacy and novelty and those kind of things. So that's the thing to bear in mind. So there's journals that only publish new data sets. So Data in Brief is an example of a journal that all they do is publish new data. And Patterns does have that opportunity. We have an article type called a descriptor, which is for introducing new outputs, where people can introduce new data sets, new frameworks, new models, all those kind of things. So it's like a specific article type for us. And that isn't the case at all journals. So it really depends on, if you're publishing in a domain journal, they might not consider the code as important as the findings. So it depends on the values of the journal as well. But yes, you have to be a little bit careful with new data sets, particularly human data sets at the moment. We do check to make sure that they're ethically produced and all those kind of things, because it's such a big problem at the minute.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just adding on to that, like the FAIR principles are really important to us. So making sure that things are reproducible and are available and are open access is like the one.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's, setting a standard that we can also echo to multiple publications. It's just becoming make it the new normal.
I hope so. That's what we're after. I'm a bit of a vigilante editor, but we're getting there. It will be my way. There's a question there about sharing the slides, and I'm absolutely happy for you to send the slides out to everyone who attends. If that's please do send them out after the close. They're very available, and my email and Amandalynne's email are both in there, so please do get in touch with us. We are available. We're happy to be part of your village. Oh, new question. Many authors may not have access to resources like large amounts of yes, for example, are there strategies you can consider for competing? Now that's part of the bias in the publishing industry, and a really good point, which is about resourcing. The answer to the question is quite complex, because it can be difficult to compete in a space where you simply don't have the physical resources as much as anything else. And the best way to do it is to approach networks in your area and in your domain that are working to make sure that these resources are available. So places like Deep Learning Indaba, talk to people to see if they can connect you up with someone who can provide you with the resources. I don't think there's any easy answer to this question. Go out and ask people to give it to you, and if they won't, shout at them. That's really all I've got on that one, I'm afraid.
Is it worth motivating your research that you're maybe not achieving state of the art, but with these are the techniques you've employed, and you may be 2% off state of the art, but you've done it with one GPU instead of an entire data room full.
Absolutely. That is such a good idea. I mean, if I saw that in someone's abstract, I would consider that a really valuable contribution to the field. Demonstrating how these things can be performed in low resource environments is a big topic of interest at the moment, and we would value contributions along those lines. And lots of venues would, I think, showcasing how you can do it in a space where you're rural, or you've got bad Wi-Fi, or even these simple problems can make such a big difference to your research. And yeah, absolutely. If anyone's out there writing that, do send it in.
Wow, that's good to know.
Low resources. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, Tessa. I'll chip into the next question. This one's for Amandalynne. So, like, conferences like NeurIPS have included this broader impact statement. And I know that you said you're interested in like the broader impact of people's research. Like, how would you say, from your perspective, people should approach having a look at the broader impact of their research? Is it something that I guess sometimes people do at the end of the research? Do you have like strategies for thinking about that?
Oh, she's muted. So whilst are you back, Amandalynne? You up?
Sorry, was that a question for me?
Yeah, I was just asking about how you consider approaching impact statements and how you consider the impact of your work. It's one of the most common questions we get. You know, how do I write about the impact of my work? So just wondering, how you go about it.
Yeah, this is something that I'm still actively learning about, I would say, because it's not something that I feel like is commonly taught as part of a machine learning curriculum. But certainly it's something that you see, constantly in newspapers or just sort of like through people posting to social media about some bad experience they had with like a system that, treated them unfairly. So I think this is like an area of active research for me, is trying to identify like how can we incentivize and promote having researchers think. The other difficult thing is
Amandalynne, sorry, I think you
can't always predict the worst possible. Sorry, get cut out again.
Do you want to try turning your video off again? We were doing all right on voice.
Okay, I'm sorry. How far did I get before I got cut out?
You're talking about incentivizing impact consideration.
I'll say that this is, I guess, what I was saying was that this is still sort of an active area of research for me, is trying to figure out how to incentivize and promote, just make it so that it's not, on the end, but something that is there throughout the course of a research. There was a really great tutorial at the FACT conference this year. I am blanking on the title of the paper, but I think it's if you look up a life course approach to research impact, it was at FACCT 2021 is the conference that it was hosted at, and I believe Kate Sim was the first author, but I don't recall. But yeah, I would say this is an area of active research where people are looking at how to sort of come up with what sorts of questions to promote thinking, prospectively about what the impact of your research from the very beginning of the project inception to the data collection to the evaluation and release. So yeah, I guess the short answer is this is something that I'm still thinking about and learning about myself.
Okay, thank you.
Insider knowledge, NeurIPS really struggled with their impact statement this year. They found that people thought it was a nightmare. They considered it a barrier to submission. Authors decided not to submit because they had to think about the impact of their work. So I think we're changing lanes in the field, and it is providing friction. It is causing trouble. But there are actually guidelines out there. NeurIPS has guidelines on how to write their impact statement. It is difficult. It does seem weird, but it is only 200 words, and you can do it. Oh, an excellent question. Should I publish to archive before publishing to a journal? So preprint servers are generally considered exempt from the reproduction rules, which means that you can publish on archive whilst your piece is under consideration at a journal. And I would recommend it. I think papers get better for being available on archive, for being that open and that available to people. And you also get feedback. So whilst you're getting feedback from the journal and from the reviewers, you'll be getting community feedback on your work. So if you share it and you publicize it, you'll get more input. Journals do require that you don't publish the final version. So you can publish a version once it's under consideration. You can't publish another version. So it's worth checking out those rules as you go along. But I would really recommend putting things on archive or on whichever preprint server works for your domain. It's great. It makes them accessible.
Just a follow-up question on that. I guess if you are, let's say, submitting to a journal that aims to be anonymous, how do you think like publishing to a preprint server, like I guess, impacts your submission? Because obviously it is a recommendation that reviewers should not kind of break that third wall if you, let's say, do have your paper out in a preprint server. I'm not sure if my question makes sense.
It does. So interestingly, we have reviewers that sometimes pretend they're not reviewers and give authors feedback. It depends on the review system at the journal. Lots of journals are moving towards open review, which means that everybody knows what everybody said. So rather than it being anonymous reviewers, you will start to get attributed reviews. And that's meant to tackle what Amandalynne was talking about earlier, where people aren't getting the credits for reviews that they deserve. You know, it's a job, it takes up a lot of time, and it's often quite in the background of their academic career. So it's a way of highlighting that. But there are multiple different kinds of reviews. So there's single blind, where the reviewers know who the author is. There's double blind, where no one knows who anybody is. And it's worth checking at the venue you're considering publishing with which model they're using. Publishing on archive in advance, I've never seen that affect a submission in terms of reviewers, but we do sometimes get them going chatting to the authors kind of independently because they're interested in the development of the paper, and that's allowed. That's perfectly acceptable because it enriches the paper. You know, anything to make the work as good as it can be before it goes out, really.
Okay, thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Good. I'm just looking at the questions in case there's anything else. Oh, excellent link out there to the paper Amandalynne was talking about. Yeah, really worth a look. And I recommend FACT as a conference. If you're working in the ethics, accountability, fairness, if you're working in any of these spaces, FACT is great at sponsoring people to go as well. So absolutely go to that next year. Highly recommend it. And quick product placement for my friend. There's a new conference coming up in October called EAMO, EAAMO, which is about mechanism design for social good and data in difficult contexts and going back to low resourcing. It's going to be really interesting for that. And tickets for that one have just become available. They're 25 quid full price and discounted in lots of different ways for people who need support. So really worthwhile as a conference, I think. It's for good.
Thanks for the tip. We're going to start wrapping up. I'd just like to ask if you, Tessa and Amandalynne, have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with the community?
I feel like I've waffled a lot. I just want to reiterate my points about, you know, it takes a village. Find your people. Make sure that you're talking to lots of people. It's sometimes too many cooks spoil the broth, but realistically with papers, they just get better. It's harder. It's a pain in the ass. You have to email people who don't respond. Don't be dejected. Just get in there and find people who'll help you because they're out there. I don't know if Amandalynne's got anything to add at the end there.
Can folks hear me?
Yes.
No, you can. Okay. This is kind of a very interesting end note, but something that was a source of surprise for me was that, at least when I was first getting started, was that there are a lot of formatting requirements for different publications and journals. So I would say familiarize yourself with LaTeX or, you know, however you choose to pronounce that formatting software. I would say overleaf.com is a great place to, you know, download a paper's template from the paper website and just give yourself a lot of time to compile the paper and make sure there's no bugs. Because that's one of the most infuriating things in preparing a publication is like last minute little formatting bugs. But yeah, I will also echo more broadly Tessa's question or Tessa's point about, you know, reaching out to community and, you know, including for resolving LaTeX bugs or for, you know, targeting particular venues. And yeah, so sorry about the Wi-Fi issues. Hopefully I was still able to get some interesting ideas out there.
No, it's
absolutely not.
And if you do submit in LaTeX, one last point, if you decide to submit in LaTeX, for the love of the Lord, send us all the files. There's nothing worse than chasing people for their .tex file. Just send it us. We can't do anything with the PDF.
Noted.
That's my final word.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much thank you to Tessa and Amandalynne for your insights. This has been fantastic. And thank you to everyone for attending. I think we can initiate a virtual round of applause. It's just Kaliam and I, but we'll cheer you on. But I'm sure everyone else out there is clapping as well.
So good to chat to you all. It was lovely.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And we hope everyone in the audience is inspired to submit their own papers now. So don't forget to sign up for a one-on-one mentorship session at the Deep Learning Indaba before submitting your papers. It's open to all members of the Deep Learning Indaba community. And if you'd also like to sign up as a mentor, you are welcome to use the same website as well. We'd love to have you join our community as well. So yeah, thank you. And I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much.
What a delight.
Okay, thanks.